From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we shouldn't only celebrate the greatest living Americans when they pass from our midst. And with that spirit in mind, we wish the greatest living American, James Arthur Lovell Jr., Cleveland, Ohio, Captain, U.S. Navy, Pilot, Gemini 7, Commander, Gemini 12, Command Module Pilot, Apollo 8, and of course, most famously, the mission that made him the American Shackleton, Commander Apollo 13, a happy, very happy 97th birthday yesterday, and many happy returns. We can do some Apollo talk tonight if the audience would like, but the normal rule applies. If you get into any idiotic moon landing conspiracy horse shit, you are banned from the chat. There will be no prior warning. And with those pleasantries having been dispensed with, good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radius. Happy Easter. Happy WrestleMania Sunday. If you're watching us instead of WrestleMania, we are very honored indeed. And here is your golden age of Western civilization news roundup for the week ending 18 April 2025. Dateline Crazy Town, Monday, 14 April. America's most morally execrable fake news disgraced journalist, 98-year-old Taylor Lorenz. Yes, she actually is older than Jim Lovell. It's a little known fact. Was in the news this week, regrettably. And how did she get in the news? Well, in that same way that psychotic, untalented hacks who have worn out their welcome in the mainstream fake news media always do. By dialing the crazy knob upward and upward for as long as it takes until somebody finally agrees to shoot an interview with you. And so what did 106-year-old Taylor Lorenz, who used to work at the New York Times until they got sick of all the lawsuits and fired her ass, and then she somehow got herself hired over at the Washington Post and spent most of her time there doxing teenagers for being transphobic, until Jeff Bezos also got sick of all the lawsuits and fired her ass. What did she have to do this week to get a little taste of that sweet, sweet nectar of 2 minutes of cable TV FaceTime? Well, she had to publicly orgasm over a cold-blooded killer, allegedly. And if you question that characterization, I encourage you to view the footage and then dispute it. I don't want to get too graphic here. I know we have lots of elderly viewers with delicate sensibilities, but you can practically hear the sound of her thighs moistening as she talks about how totally dreamy Luigi Mangione is. Luigi Mangione, of course, is the maniac who, allegedly, murdered the CEO of a healthcare company in New York City last year for the crime of being the CEO of a healthcare company. And for reasons that are so bizarre I am powerless to comprehend them, a lot of dumb leftist women like 119-year-old Taylor Lorenz think that makes him a very desirable sex symbol, which I think is not an unreasonable inference when you hear the way that the 212-year-old Ms. Lorenz is quite literally purring and cooing as she is describing the murderer's wonderful personal qualities. But if anything, at least she understands the game she is playing here, because that's just the front end of the project. After all, positioning yourself as the same sort of chick who would have camped out on the sidewalk for Charlie Manson, or sent pussy pics to Ted Bundy, or married the Night Stalker, you get a certain amount of exposure from that, from your fellow idiot wokester who say, yeah, I guess that killer is pretty dreamy now that I think about it. The back end of the project, probably the most lucrative part, is the conservative outrage. So right on cue, here is 326-year-old Taylor Lorenz on the Sean Hannity show the other night. And that is exactly the 2-minute cable TV hit she was trying so desperately to get. And she sits there with a straight face protesting that, oh, no, of course those aren't my feelings about Luigi. I am just relating what I have heard other women say. While rubbing my thighs together vigorously as my eyes roll back in my head and I pound the table shouting, yes, 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 Luigi, my mighty Roman vengeance god! As the girl holding the microphone boom quietly remarks, I'll have what that 367-year-old lady is having. Dateline Washington, Tuesday, 15 April. The fake city government in our nation's capital announced the beginning of their alleged annual spring cleaning initiative this week, the news of which might come as a shock to people who regularly visit the city and think it looks pretty grimy and filthy the whole year round. Fake Mayor Muriel Bowser, having just emerged from a lengthy period in hiding while recovering from the terrible indignity of Trump forcing her to erase the big Black Lives Matter letters that she ordered festooned upon the ground of the 800 block of 16th Avenue back during the summer of love in 2020. But my favorite part of that story, That was when a kid got arrested and charged with an actual hate crime for doing donuts in that intersection and thus desecrating the fake mayor's graffiti that she put on the ground. Because that's where we are in America in the third decade of the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen. We only focus on the important things that really matter. I mean, I can picture giving the kid a ticket for reckless driving, being kind of a dickhead, but they didn't care about any of that. The fake city government of Washington decided that the only perceived offense they cared about here was that they characterized leaving a tire mark on top of the word black as an act of intolerable race hatred that has to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I mean, it's basically the same thing as slavery when you get right down to it. And here's the part where I state for the 10th or the 20th time, my vision for the future of the District of Columbia. It should be depopulated of permanent residents, just like the Gaza Strip should be, and it should be transformed into a nice museum city and an America theme park. The kind of place that average American parents would never have to think twice about taking their kids to. The kind of place Disneyland used to be, before they charged you $150 a head just for your daughter to get groomed by a fat, bearded transvestite as soon as she gets in the door. Our founders never viewed the District of Columbia as a traditional city that lots of people would live in, and it never was that, not for the first 80 or so years at least. It only became that when the city had to be garrisoned during the Civil War. The War of Dastardly Yankee Aggression. When, as a practical matter, Washington City, as it was called in those days, was a territorial exclave of the United States. Virginia was in full rebellion on one side, and on the other side, sure, Maryland never actually seceded from the Union, but it was a slave state, and there was no shortage of rebel sympathizers there, even actual rebels. But the fact that Washington ever gained a sizable permanent population is still, right up to the present day, a weird vestige of the war between the states, and one that we ought to fix. The first step should be getting rid of the fake city government and returning, in principle and in practice, to direct federal administration. And let's stop pretending Washington will ever be a state. It's gonna be America Disneyland, brought to you by Trump Resorts Incorporated, and it's gonna be great. It's gonna be fantastic. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. And we will build the Trump Monument on the site where the Hoover Building once stood, because fuck you, Edgar. Dateline San Salvador, Wednesday, 16 April. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, whom you had probably never heard of 7 days ago, managed to make himself into the most widely mocked man in the whole country by the end of the work week, which, irrespective of whose side you're on, I think we can all agree that that's quite an auspicious achievement indeed. With this weird sort of quasi-religious pilgrimage that he made down to San Salvador to check on the welfare of the constituent whose well-being matters most of all to him, that being the illegal alien MS-13 gangbanger and human trafficker, allegedly, and wife-beater, allegedly, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who's really become quite the cause celeb in the media Democrat complex. I mean, hell, this is the second straight week he's been in the Roundup. That's how important this motherfucker is. But ladies and gentlemen, as intrepid journalists and ruggedly handsome slabs of USDA select man meat, we have a certain solemn duty here on this program, one of which is correcting misconceptions. So, let's talk about certain misconceptions about our friend Kilmar. Can I call you Kilmar? Or would you prefer inmate number 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6? Either way, makes no difference to me. So you may have heard, you've almost certainly heard, that Kilmar was deported to El Salvador by mistake, even though he is a Salvadoran national, which seems weird. And if you're on the media Democrat complex side of things, you're arguing that this administrative error should render the whole process moot and invalid, and homeboy should be able to come back home to Maryland and smack his old lady around a little bit more. So how can it be an administrative error when you deport a scumbag back to the very self-same country the scumbag is from? Well, because Kilmar, a few years ago, he managed to convince some idiot Biden immigration judge that he can't be sent back to El Salvador because, you see, as a member of MS-13, he fears being targeted by their rival gang. But wait, I hear you say, isn't everybody in the media Democrat complex falling all over themselves saying there is no evidence this guy is an MS-13 member? Well, yes. Yes, they are. It's almost like one aspect of their argument directly negates and defeats another aspect of their argument and thus renders the whole thing invalid. And they don't want to talk about it very much, which you can't really blame them for. So let's talk about it, shall we? And let's pay particular attention to the photos of the meeting between Kilmar and his good friend Senator Van Hollen, because yes, he had to go to the prison and make a goddamn annoying nuisance of himself for about 2.5 days, but finally, at long last, he did manage to secure a meeting with Kilmar. Now, what's the first thing that jumps out at the viewer about these pictures? Well, Kilmar is wearing a Kansas City Chiefs hat, which seems like a weird thing for a Maryland senator to bring along for this guy to wear. It seems like a Maryland senator would bring a Ravens hat, unless he was afraid of his constituents freaking out about their team's hat being on that dude's head. Or, the other possibility is, he wanted to subtly sort of throw shade at one of the Ravens' most hated rivals, in which case, you have to say, that's a pretty good troll. Now, the second thing that jumps out at you about these photographs is the array of beverages that are sitting on the table. And this became a matter of some controversy yesterday, since President Bukele of El Salvador accused the senator of sipping margaritas with the MS-13 dude. So I'm going to tell you exactly what happened here. And it's actually pretty funny. So Van Hollen's people, when they were staging the scene, they told Kilmar, you gotta keep your hands out of sight, keep them under the table so nobody can see your MS-13 knuckle tats. So what does Bukele do? He keeps sending his people in with an enticing array of yummy beverages in the hope they can get the guy to break and take a sip. Meanwhile, as much fun as it is to laugh at all of that, let's also bear in mind there is no record of Chris Van Hollen ever placing a call or sending a note of condolence to any of his actual constituents who have lost loved ones or been otherwise suffered from the depredations of Joe Biden's illegal aliens. And he should be ashamed of himself for that. If he thought this stunt this week was going to be some sort of springboard to the presidency, well, he's a fucking idiot. Dateline Atlanta, Thursday, 17 April. In a story that reminds us the hilarious extent to which the legacy fake news media have completely lost their ability to shape public opinion, a CNN poll, and God, how painful it must have been for them to publish these numbers, indicated this week that 56% of Americans are fully supportive of every person unlawfully present in the country being forcibly removed. And just think about the years and decades and money and resources that have been expended and all the prestige and credibility that have been squandered by CNN and its fellow legacy fake news sludge factories in the pursuit of making everybody love illegal aliens. And for a while, up to a point, it actually worked reasonably well. But you can see how the law of diminishing returns comes into play when you consider that in 2016, less than a decade ago, when Obama was still the president, that number stood at 38%. But even still, even then, when it looks like it was a manageable number politically, it was already trending in the wrong direction for the Dems, as evidenced by the fact that Donald Trump won the White House that year on the most hawkish immigration campaign of the last 100 years or more. But still, they persisted in the belief that if they had a dutiful fake news media establishment running interference for them on this stuff, they could still manage to make the project successful. And when they bet the whole farm and every animal on the farm in order to drag the corpse of Joe Biden into the White House in 2020, they knew this was probably their last chance to complete the front end of the project. You see, getting the 15 or 20 million illegals into the country is only half the battle. The back end of the project is that you have to make it impossible to remove any of them. And that's what this Kilmar Abrego Garcia thing is really about. That's why we are seeing such unhinged, indefensible rulings from Democrat Party apparatchik judges, because if Trump is actually able to remove all of these imported criminals en masse, then the open borders project that took both parties 60 years to build lies in ruins. Along with the dream of every free trade globalist douchebag that was happy to enrich himself on the back of that whole crooked-ass system by hollowing out his own country and consigning its own people to decay and despair while he laughed all the way to the bank. Do I like it when people like that lose and suffer? Yeah, you bet your sweet ass I do. I like it when they lose damn good and hard. Dateline Ottawa, Friday, 18 April. Canada's newly elected Prime Minister... Wait, that's not right, sorry. Canada's new unelected Prime Minister took great pains this week to distance himself from the disgraced former Prime Minister Trudeau, during the first round of debates ahead of this fall's general election up in the Great White North, and I guess it's a peculiar quirk of the Westminster parliamentary system, some might even call it a fatal flaw, that it allows for a man to become the head of government who has been elected to no office whatsoever. And yeah, I know the Canadian system isn't a direct copy of the Westminster system, it's more of a bastardized, sort of semi-Americanized hybrid version of it, but clearly it retains possibly the worst flaw of said system. And why is that important? Well, because it's damn difficult to position yourself as a democratic leader when you have been installed in office by means other than voters voting for you. The only example we have in this country that is remotely close to that is Jerry Ford ascending to the presidency 50 years ago despite having been elected to no higher office than congressman from the Michigan 5th District. But he was elected to something, damn it! Prime Minister Mark Carney? Not so much. And I'm at the boundary of my knowledge here because I understand how an unelected prime minister can be installed by the party currently in power, but if he wants to remain the prime minister, which he says he does, then doesn't he have to be elected to the House of Commons from the district where he resides? I don't know, somebody should tell me in the chat, or has the whole fucking world gone mad? That's possible too. And though it looked for a time like Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives were in a position to claim power in the general election, if the current polling is to be believed, the Canadian people are such impossibly self-hating cucks that it looks like they might actually return the Liberals to power, even after the last decade plus of a ruling party mistreating the citizenry in ways that previously could not have been imagined anywhere in the Anglosphere. But I guess you can't save people from themselves. I just hope this trade war ends soon because, goddammit, I haven't had a decent bowl of poutine in weeks. And that's the end of the roundup. Don't think I don't see you glancing away and watching WrestleMania because I prattle on so goddamn long. It's a two-way camera, you know. Okay, and speaking of being saved from yourself, it's just about that time for your humble correspondent. And so with that, I hand you off to my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, a man who is so hairy you can fill up a heavy bag with what he leaves behind after a body wax, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.